Hello everybody and welcome to our behind the scenes tour of our special exhibition Photo Friend, the British Army in Germany since 1945. Conquerors, occupiers, allies, friends. The British Army's relationship with Germany has certainly been complex, and in our special exhibition we explore this wonderful and interesting and fascinating history from when the British Army first fought their way into Germany in 1945 to when they've only just left in the last months or so. We hear directly from the soldiers themselves, we see the objects they carried, we hear the stories they know, and we explore their experiences of not only them but also their families and also their German neighbours. We learn about the British Army's role in crucial periods of our history, not just in our country but the world, and we see how that's impacted upon what the Army does. Throughout I'm going to highlight some of our key objects, some of our key stories, and hopefully provide you a wonderful insight into how we put this exhibition together and what you can see when you come and join us. I really hope you enjoy it. I think when we look at the history of the British Army in Germany, sometimes we forget just how hard the fighting was coming through in those last days of the war. And the British were fighting for every village, every crossing, and they were battling their way through. They were also uncovering some pretty horrific things, and none more so than what they found on the 15th of April 1945, when advanced units of the British Army found the Belson concentration camp. And for the British, this was their first visceral view of the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust machine, and it absolutely characterised the way in which they responded to the Germans, what they thought about the Germans. Attitudes hardened in the aftermath. There was a sense that there was absolutely no way local German people could have not known what was happening just down the road from them. When the British entered Belson, they were horrified by what they saw. 60,000 emaciated, dying prisoners, 13,000 corpses in the camp already. What they began immediately was a medical operation to try and save as many people as they could. And in that regard, the efforts of the Royal Army Medical Corps and the attached medical personnel were so important. This medical kit was carried by a Major Grice, who was one of the first medical officers to enter the camp. And really, the tools he had available were insufficient for what had to be done. And yet they made an effort, they made a start. And gradually, the scale of the operation built, and the British were able to save much more than was thought possible when confronting this human disaster. The scale of the horror of Belson really cannot be overstated. It was so shocking for the British. It was so unlike anything they'd ever even imagined could have taken place. The fact they were able to mobilise so quickly, especially during the middle of actually fighting a war, is remarkable and one of the most particular and significant aspects of the British early days in Germany. And yet from the British, they took over the local camp at Hohne and established a field hospital there to save as many of the inmates of Belson as they could. And even after this was taken place, and even after many of those people had been released and recovered, although sadly many more died, the British stayed in Hohne and it became a major base for them until 2015. So whilst there was absolute horror at what the British first found in Germany, really the shadow of Belson was cast over their entire deployment there.
The non-frat rule, we must not fraternise with Germans, only talk as business. And we had taken over the whole village and surrounded it with barbed wire. The inhabitants had been turned out and found accommodation elsewhere locally. And the housewives were allowed in each day to clean their own houses for us.
In 1945, when the British arrived in Germany, having won victory in the Second World War, they were presented with the challenge of how they were now going to occupy and control Germany, how they were going to enforce a sense of defeat. For Field Marshal Montgomery, who'd led 21st Army Group into Germany, he was quite clear on this. There was to be no fraternisation at all. The Germans was to be told they'd been defeated. A sense of victory from the Allies was to be forced upon them. There were parades. There were dismantling of German Nazi structures, social structures, new political systems. The map of Germany was literally redrawn by the Allies, all of which enforced a sense of defeat upon them. Field Marshal Montgomery himself had served in the original British Army of the Rhine from 1919 to 1929, and he saw the failure to enforce such a sense of defeat on the Germans after the First World War as being a major cause of the Second. He was not going to make the same mistake. And his policy of non-fraternisation was designed to make sure the Germans knew that they'd been defeated. There could be no question about a resurgence in nationalism in the aftermath of the war. Now, the content of these letters varies because Montgomery made several adjustments to this policy. Initially, it was extremely harsh and it was very clear. And then latterly, the policy was expanded and relaxed a little so that the British soldiers could speak to children and that sort of thing as well and show some elements of human kindness. And yet at the same time, underneath this, there's this story of the official policy and then the reality on the ground. And in fact, what you can see by looking at the history is the British soldiers were already making strong bonds with their German neighbours. There were relationships forming, there were marriages being proposed. And so already the change in that relationship from enemy to friend was taking place. In the aftermath of May 1945, the victorious Allies had each taken a zone of occupation of Germany. For the British, in the ruins of Germany's industrial heartland, they were quite clear how they wanted to rebuild this. They were going to re-establish factories, they were going to re-establish businesses, but under a radical social overhaul of the German system. However, the ideological differences between the victorious Allies that had been put to one side whilst the war was on had rapidly begun to re-emerge. The Soviets were being recognised as an increasing threat, and actually Britain was staring down the face of the new war so soon after the Second World War had passed. This Cold War as it became, and this ideological confrontation, saw the British re-evaluate their relationship with their German neighbours. Whilst originally they'd been enemies, increasingly they were becoming friends, they were becoming allies, and actually the British were going to protect them. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, it was only actually the latest part of a system that had seen the British get ever closer with their German neighbours as they sought to confront the rising Russian threat. In this case, it really is an example of moving from foe to friend, as the British were forced to rely on the Germans, as Germany was going to be where the next major confrontation with the Soviet Union was going to be fought. For the British, initially, when they got to Germany, they held a series of military parades that were designed to celebrate their victory and at the same time enforce a sense of defeat on the Germans. And yet, as the Soviets became more hostile and the Cold War became more apparent, actually these parades became opportunities to build friendships, build bridges with their local German neighbours. From 1947, the Berlin Tattoo had been a major event held every year by the British in their sector of the city that brought pageantry, bands, synchronised marching together, and increasingly Germans were invited to it, invited to take part. And actually, as you can see from this sign here from the 1980s, it's actually advertising for German guests as well, German guests of the Commandant of West Berlin. And this relationship, I think, was completely unconceivable, unthinkable in 1945. And yet by the 1980s, there's been this transformation. The British have lived alongside the Germans for so long. They've stood alongside them. They were standing alongside them on the front line in the Cold War. That actually these were their allies and these were their friends. And they were proud to share in both the military duties but also the social life as well that came from the occupation and the service in Germany. During the Cold War, the British Army in Germany was in a unique position because they were able to train for the war they expected to come in the place they expected to fight it. At no other point had the British Army been able to do this, even in decades afterwards, where the British Army might use some of its training facilities, even in Germany, to represent villages in Afghanistan or Iraq or something like that. Here, they were actually preparing to fight on the ground. They were going to take on the Soviets across. The Soviets were going to come rolling across the Indo-German border, and the British knew exactly where they were going to stand and fight, where they were going to counterattack, and how ultimately they were going to win. That undoubtedly brought the British and the Germans closer together, because suddenly the Germans were no longer their neighbours. They were being protected by the British, but they were also their allies, because the people the British were training alongside was the German Bundeswehr as well, which had been established, which had been grown, and which had been integrated into the British plans to fight and win the Cold War. But also, more importantly, the places on this map that made us look like military facilities were actually home. The British had brought their families with them in 1946. They laid down roots in these garrisons. And for many people, home wasn't Berkshire or Aldershot or Catterick. It was Hohne, it was Fallinbostel, it was Paderborn. And for many people, then this is what the British were going to fight for to defend. They were fighting for Britain, yes, back across the Channel, but actually really they were fighting for the little parts of Britain still in West Germany. In the early years of the British occupation of Germany, soldiers were explicitly banned from marrying German women. Yet as the decades went on, more and more relationships began to form, and these began to break down some of the social and cultural barriers that existed between the two groups. As the British remained more established in Germany, as they became more confident in getting off their bases, going into the local German towns, as sporting associations were set up, as other cultural activities and cultural exchanges were created, Germans and British soldiers met and mixed more and more. Marriages were an inevitable outcome of this, and they represent a crucial change in the relationship between the British Army and Germany. In 2010, the strategic decision was made by the government to withdraw all but a handful of British soldiers from Germany. This was part of the wider defence review that was taking place that was going to see the British Army reduced in size. And that really began the process that saw the end of an era for the British Army in Germany. From the days of 1945 to 2010, the British Army had been a constant in Germany. And yet after that, the ceremonies about the British Army leaving barracks, about moving, became extra poignant because they were going home. Yet for many, home was Osnabrück, it was Paderborn, it was Gütersloh, it was Fallinbostel. All of these places that would become an integral part of the fabric of life in the British Army that were now passing into history. And for the Germans as well, there was a real sense of poignancy. The British had been good neighbours. They'd been incredibly important in rebuilding the country in 1945. They played a major part in the economic miracle that Germany experienced. But also they've been just a general constant part of the fabric of life in that area of Germany for so long that many people struggle to imagine life without them. And I think for British soldiers as well, there was a recognition about what they were giving up and what they were coming home to. It was undoubtedly true that being based in Germany made the army better. And there was some considerable uncertainty for moving back about whether all those things that made service and life in Germany so good, not just for the soldier but also their families, could be replicated in the UK. It's going to be several years, I think, before we can accurately answer those questions. But for now, what we can talk about is this amazing legacy of this wonderful period in the Army's history, a period that's unlikely to ever be repeated.
The first headline is Foe to Friend. The miracle of overcoming the wounds, the scars of World War II is one of the big things. And the Army played an important part in that. Army and soldiers very quickly going down from occupation force into living in the German community and building the relations that we had that spread far beyond camp fences.
Thank you everybody for joining me today for this look behind the scenes of our special exhibition about the British Army's time in Germany. It really has been a story about moving from foe to friend. If you're interested and you'd like to learn more, there's going to be plenty of information on the museum's website, either in long form articles or an online collection where you can unpack more detail about these fascinating stories and these wonderful objects. Our public programme is also going to have lots of events connected to the theme of the Army in Germany as well, so lots more coming up for us to explore more of this fascinating story. We really hope we can see you in the museum soon, but until then, goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed watching the first in our series of 3 tours looking at our Foe to Friend exhibition. I'm joined today by Dr. Peter Johnston, who you just saw on the stream giving that wonderful tour. He is the lead curator of this exhibition and head of collections research and academic access here at the National Army Museum. Today's tour's gone out across a number of platforms, so we're collating together any questions that have been asked, and Peter's kindly agreed to spend some time answering them. We'll try and get through as many as we can in the time that we have. I just wanted to kick things off though first by asking you, Peter, if you could tell us a bit about the backstory to this exhibition. How did you have the idea, and why is it an important story for us to be telling?
Yeah, so the idea for this exhibition actually came about in 2015, and I was sat at home and I was watching the news, and there was a short, really short piece on the news about Hona closing and being shut down. And I was sort of sat there thinking, well, I wonder what's happening to all this stuff, to all of this history, to all of this heritage. You know, I've studied the history of the British Army for a long time. I knew the Army was still in Germany. I knew they were still using it for training. I knew they were still using it as a launch pad to move around the world. But also I knew that since 2010, I think the drawdown was taking place and had been sort of mandated by the SDSR from that stage. And that just got me thinking. I was saying, well, what's going to happen to this? You know, this is really important. And then more importantly, what can the actual National Army Museum do to document this really crucial aspect of the Army's history? And I began asking a few people. At the MOD what was going on. I began putting a few feelers out around this sort of stuff. And then in the end, I mean, it sort of was ticking along, and it was something I was keeping an eye on, but I had other projects I was working on at the time. And actually, it wasn't until I almost quite literally bumped into the commander of British Forces Germany in Montgomery House in Aldershot at a meeting down there that I was attending, that this really began to pick up with pace, because he sort of said, you know, who are you? And I said, oh, hi, I'm Dr. Peter Johnston, National Army Museum. And then we were chatting. He said, well, what are you working on now? And I said, well, actually, I'm quite interested in what's happening in Germany. He said, oh, well, you'll have to come over, meet my staff, and we'll see what we can do. And that began this wonderful process of actually getting this fantastic insight into not only what life was like in Germany and what life was like in Germany at that stage versus what had been like in previous decades, but also what was happening as part of the drawdown and being able to be witness to that, as well as having a front row seat and being inside the wire and able to really capture a lot of this history and bring it back. And what began as a collecting project evolved into this idea for an exhibition. Then obviously the book followed on top of that as well. And it all became, everything just came together in this wonderful way to mark this absolutely unique and significant period in the Army's history.
And as you say, you had an extended process of collecting items, haven't you, to go into the exhibition?
Yeah, and partly when I was sort of looking at this and I was beginning it, I came back and I looked at what was already in the National Army Museum's collection. What had already come back from Germany in the hands of soldiers, in terms of kit, in terms of stuff from options for change when the British Army, the Rhine had basically been cut in half at that stage, and a lot of the bases had been closed as well. And there'd been some previous collecting done by some of my predecessors in the museum. But then I also identified gaps. But when I was beginning to think about the exhibition, I thought, well, actually, I think the most significant way in which we can tell this story is by giving voice to the people who lived it. I was coming to this from not only from the outside as a civilian, but also from several decades past in looking backwards. And so I really wanted to get inside what it was like having been there in this different period of time. And so I began this huge project about seeking out veterans, interviewing veterans, capturing their memories, but also capturing their ideas about the objects and the stories that they'd like to see in an exhibition of this type. I wanted to provide a narrative, a chronological overview, and I wanted to balance the big geopolitical confrontations with the personal individual stories too. And I think it's been wonderful, and thank you so much to everybody who gave up their time to help me with that. It's I have to say the BFG community were absolutely wonderful in supporting this, and I couldn't have done it without guys like in fact some of the guys who are still in Senelager now. They know who they are. Hopefully some of them are listening, but without them actually helping me, this never could have been done. And so it's testament not only to the experience they lived, but also the amount of work they put in on my behalf too.
Oh, it's an absolutely fascinating exhibition, as we've just seen, but when we're able to reopen, we'd all definitely recommend a visit. We've had a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to take us back in time to begin with. The first question asks, when, in emphases, did the plans for how we will handle restoring order start to be coalesced? Was it in a committee effort during the last 6 months or so of the war? Or was it a we'll need a plan stance, something that started much earlier before they were on the cusp of victory?
Yeah, so the idea about how essentially the what's going to happen to Germany is formulated really in 1944. Once the Allies successfully opened the Second Front, once they land in Normandy and begin the breakout and the drive across northern France from there, it becomes quite clear that they are going to win the war, and there's going to need to be some kind of post-war plan and construction. They don't just get to May 1945 and think, right, what are we going to do now? It's something they begin to formulate earlier on, and actually you can see as they move through Normandy and parts of France, the way in which the military government is imposed there is sort of like a prototype for how they're going to take control of a larger area of Germany. Because that's how the Allies are essentially instilling order in what is, northern France, a friendly country, but one that has no real civic or political structures in place because of the nature of the German occupation. The Allies impose a military government to basically keep things moving, and that's essentially what they're going to do. They're just going to transplant it into an enemy country and expand it. And of course, it's important to realize at the same time as they're driving towards Germany, in southern Europe, they're getting ready to cross from Italy into Austria and do a similar thing there too. And in fact, they've been installing military governments through Italy as the armies have been advancing up there as well. So this is something that the Western Allies are planned for. Now, the specific political direction, the political goals are formulated at some of the big conferences. At Yalta, they've already decided that Germany will be divided up, but it's not until Potsdam in 1945, after the war, that the sort of specific borders of the zones are actually formally agreed, and the terms of the occupation are actually formally agreed, and some of the structures are put in place. The Kommandantur, for example, that takes up residence in Berlin. That's going to be the Allies working together to negotiate issues. All of that can only obviously happen after the war's been won. And it's really that Potsdam Conference that formulates this, and the key aims being, denazification, demilitarization, and essentially stabilizing Germany. Now, obviously, what is also key to remember is the Allies have very, very different goals in what they want to do with this. Initially, the French aren't even actually considered, which causes a bit of a problem within the Western Allies. But, the Soviets are coming in very much with a sense of retribution and punitive. This is about exacting reparations for what the Germans had, the terrible destruction the Germans had wrought in the Soviet Union. Whereas the Allies, it was more about a long-term peaceful future rather than anything else. There was talk about reparations, obviously, but there was also more talk about what would happen to Germany in the aftermath. And some of those more extreme plans included, one of the plans was to essentially destroy all the German factories and turn it into sort of an agrarian farm nation where all they could do is farm, and they wouldn't have the heavy industry necessary to convert to wartime production, or they were going to flood all the mines and stuff like that. And these were the competing ideas that were coming out from amongst the Allies. And then, as I said in the film, those ideologies really begin to, once the necessity of the wartime alliance has been removed, those competing ideologies really emerge, and a new conflict begins.
We've had another question sort of leading on from this, which asks, did British occupation troops work with disarmed German troops?
Yes, they did. And actually, it's one of the interesting sort of things that takes place quite rapidly is that they're actually the POWs, for example, are brought back. There's a huge number of POWs, both of the British and the Americans and the Western Allies have taken in the advance into Germany. But don't forget, there's also a large number of POWs in Britain. There are POWs in Canada, and all of these have to eventually be repatriated. And some of the problems that the British have or British face in terms of their governance of Germany are about things like moving fuel or getting food in. And so obviously in that first autumn of 1945, when these get the harvest in, well, what's the largest source of manpower that the military government can call on at that stage? It's German POWs. And so they essentially, obviously they're all disarmed anyway, but they essentially mobilized German POWs in an operation called Operation Barleycorn, which is to get them out into the fields and bring in the harvest, which is what they're going to need to feed the Germans through the winter. And the winter of 1945 into 46 was very, very harsh winter indeed. And so this was really important. Likewise, Operation Coal Scuttle was about getting into the mines and getting this stuff, getting coal shifted for fuel around the British zone as well. The scale of destruction that the British encountered in Germany really is almost beyond comprehension. Nothing functioned, nothing worked. And so they're really starting from scratch. And yes, the Germans were very much brought into that early on. Then later, obviously, of course, the German police is purged and denazified to a certain extent, although there's an element of pragmatism that takes place within that. Similarly, the German border force, the Bordergrenzschutz, is stood up to monitor the German border between the Western and Eastern Germany, and lots of former soldiers end up in there. In fact, someone I spoke to, he remembered he served in the 50s, and he'd been doing a patrol recce of the inner German border. He'd been with one of these German guards, and someone had tried to escape, and he saw this German guard sort of reach under the wire and help pull him through and help pull him to the west. And he said his sleeve had rolled up and he'd seen his SS tattoo, and he thought, and this was the first time he'd even considered what this guy might have done during the war. And it really made him stop and take stock about what he thought about all of this sort of thing. So, there was a sense of living in the present and dealing with the present problems, but that sort of shadow of the past definitely was long and was very much present in what the British and the Americans were facing in those first few years of the occupation, at least.
And this is something that the exhibition begins with, isn't it? This discussion of starting off as enemies and slowly, as we go through the course of time, this transition in the relationship, this new things come into being in the relationship between the two parties. We've got a question asking, when was the first officially recognised British and German marriage?
See, that is a really good question. The classic historian's answer, it depends. Officially recognised. Now, they really takes place in 1945. but the application of the sort of the non-fraternization laws varied hugely across commanders and senior commanders and senior officers within the British zone. I mean, I know of somebody, sadly he's passed away now, but I know of somebody who had been based in Paderborn, obviously where the army stayed and is just down the road from still now. And he'd been working in a clerical role. He'd had a German secretary assigned to him. They talked, they fell in love. He wanted to get married. He asked for permission, and his commanding officer posted him to Hamburg, a couple of 100 kilometers away, because he was absolutely against it. And so he posted him away. Now he managed to rework his way, several posting to get back down to Paderborn, and they did end up getting married in 1946. But this was some of the obstruction that people were facing. But there were other marriages taking place. I think what's interesting is that, I mean, you'd certainly expect this from the general demographic of the British Army. But what's taking place is there's a huge number of marriages between British men and German women, and yet there are British women serving with the army throughout this period as well. The women are always there, and yet they're serving in uniform, and yet they are not. There's not a reciprocal nature of that relationship between British women and German men, which is one of the interesting things I found in this research as well. And I think that really is part of the general sort of structures of the army at the time. I think it's something that would be worth delving into a bit more, is about the actual relationships between British women and the German men in it from a romantic sense throughout it. And it's something that perhaps I'll come back to in future. Like all good history projects, things don't just end when you finish the book. There's always something more. There's always a couple of loose ends you want to go back and tie up. And I mean, if it wasn't the case, we'd all be out of a job. So
infinite rabbit warren for you to explore, it seems, this subject. We've had a question about the British role in Volkswagen, which I know is something we touch on in one of the tours that's still to come. But the question asker has asked, can you give any other examples of our involvement in restoring German industry?
Yep, absolutely. And thank you for the question about other examples, because it means we don't have to ruin what's going to be the next tour, which gives you all the reason to come back and watch the next one. But there's other things like the British are obviously heavily involved in Hanover Flughafen and establishing the airport there. But Der Spiegel, the magazine, the German magazine, which is obviously very famous, that is founded by the British as well. That's actually founded by the British and set up and designed to provide a criticism of what life is like in Germany. That's not created to give a really positive idea about, it's not created as propaganda to tell the Germans how wonderful the military government is. It's designed to be not confrontational, but critical in outlook. And when things are going wrong, it will call them out. When things are going right, it will praise them. And that's created in the setup, and obviously still runs today, and is still a major German news outlet. And that again is all thanks to the British. But there's lots of other small little things dotted around. Breweries are re-established. Smaller factories, smaller concerns are helped set up again, either through the provision of raw materials or sourcing labour or anything like that. Because obviously any kind of large-scale operation like that, the person running it will probably have to have gone through a denazification process. They will have been investigated, and some in more detail than others. Others would have produced what was known as Perselschein, sort of this like an affidavit, which would have basically saying how much they resisted the Nazis, or they weren't really a proper Nazi or anything like that if they'd been in the party. And all of this stuff was coming through, and this was one of the really complicated things the British had to do, because they wanted to re-establish the German economy, particularly as the confrontation with the Soviet Union hotted up. They needed an alternative political as well as economic system, because they feared that if the German citizens of their zone had nothing, then what would prevent them from having a communist revolution, essentially? What do they have to lose? So they wanted to re-establish a capitalism, but a depoliticized capitalism, or a new form of liberal democracy, as it was then too. So they established these new political but also economic systems, and that's ultimately what actually led to the Berlin airlift, was the unification of the currencies and the buy zone between the British and the Americans and this sort of thing, and how that was all even by 1947, 48. They were already emerging as strong economic powerhouses in comparison to the Soviet East.
Well, I've got two more audience questions, which are relating to sort of more personal links with this story. We've had quite a lot of people watching this premiere sharing their connections and stories of their service. So thank you very much for doing that. The first one is someone has said that our late uncle served at Paderborn in what we think was, forgive me this, the Kinman Corps, Kinemacorps. Could you please elaborate on what it did?
I'd have to look into that. That's not something that immediately rings a bell. What did you say? The Kinacorp?
Kinema Corps.
I'll have to look into that. Sorry, that's not something that immediately rings a bell. But I will. I'll have a look and try and get back to you. Yeah, as I say, there were lots of these smaller organisations that were sort of milling around, because of course what I also haven't talked about so far is all the displaced persons that were in this. There were a lot of internal refugees, but also there were former prisoners of war that Germany had taken. There was Polish prisoners of war, there were Soviet prisoners of war. There were obviously Jews that had been moved around and elsewhere. People from multiple nationalities all milling around in this smashed up zone. And the British were trying to sort of maintain a control over all of this. And some of them, they coalesced into sort of long-standing groups. Those of you who did serve in BFG probably would have come across the Mojos or the Mixed Services Organization. They grew up out of Polish refugees who were stranded in West, who were stranded in the British zone when the war ended, or rather liberated in the British zone when the war ended, and decided not to go back to Poland for relatively obvious reasons. And so they went to work for the British, and they coalesced, as I say, into the Mixed Services Organization. But there were Germans working in there as well, local civilians that were employed. That was a major source of manpower for the British too. And all of this came together in these sort of work parties that worked right across the British zone on various projects.
Oh, when you mentioned the displaced people, the other question about personal connections is sort of asking where we could potentially look for more information. So this viewer says their father was in Berlin in 1944 onwards for SO1 civil affairs. They think that he went to live in the Harz Mountains, and they think he was involved in the return of refugees due to the large amount of hotel accommodation in the area. But where might they find out more information about what a relative did?
If he served in the British Army, the place you'll need to go is you'll need to contact the Army Personnel Centre, because they still hold all the service records of service personnel from 1922 onwards. And as next of kin, you can apply, and they'll send you a copy of those records, and it will list specifically where he went and what he did. And that becomes your foundation piece for then going further. It's likely he was working with the Control Commission Germany, the CCG, who were mostly Foreign Office. And there's Foreign Office files are all accessible in the National Archives. And so you can go there and consult those too. You might be able to track him in the Army lists as well. If he was an SO1, he would have been an officer. Those are available online too. So you can trace him through there. But your first port of call would definitely be the Army Personnel Centre in Glasgow. And if you visit the NAM website, nam.ac.uk, you'll see the collections tab at the top, and then the first bar is research, and there's a whole load of resources in there that you can look at and read. It has all the contact information and details in there, so please do go and visit that. And if you're still stuck, drop us a line at the museum and we'll do our best to help you.
It's always good to look into all your family history in this area, and I'm glad that these events have sparked an interest for you. I want to just finish with one final thought, and by asking you, Peter, obviously we've got this story of the transition from foe to friend in the British zone, but what's it like in the other Allied zones? Does a similar pattern play out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point of contrast. And actually, I mean, when you look at what is happening in 1945 at the tail end of the war, you see this huge movement of people essentially moving west out of East Germany to escape the Russians. The Russians are bringing a terrible revenge on the German people for what had taken place there, and nobody really wants to be caught in their path. So this is when you have a huge flood of people moving west, but essentially to get to the British and the Americans. The joke about the zones was that the Americans got the scenery, obviously being down in the south with the mountains and Bavaria, and the French got the wine. But they were a late addition to having a zone of occupation, and the British got the ruins. And so, in terms of what the British did, is they were forced to be more proactive. They really took on this this mission to stabilize Germany and rebuild Germany for political imperatives and rather than anything else. But at the same time, I think there's a very particular culture within the British Army of why do people join the British Army? Well, in the Second World War, they were either volunteered or they were conscripted, and they joined to fight. But historically, the British Army's always been about going somewhere. It's always been about going to different places. The British Army doesn't really serve from home. In fact, that's why the withdrawal from Germany was so significant, because it was going to be the first time, probably since Cromwell's time, the majority of the army was actually based in the UK. But so there's always been sort of this global perspective, and soldiers have always been soldiers, obviously, but they've also been tourists and souvenir hunters. So they've always had a curiosity about the surroundings that they're in. And you see that in Germany. You know, people do want to go out and they want to see things, and they want to see the major events that they've just participated in. You know, the Monensee, the dam busters dams fall within the British zone of occupation, and guys are going up to, you know, they're jumping in their jeeps and they're going up to see those and see, you know, they've been repaired by this stage, but they're still going up to look at them. You know, pretty much from the you know, the end of May 1945. And I think the British, because they have this quite outward looking view, and because they certainly are participating in these quite obvious and deliberate attempts to stand up to the Russian expansion by, you know, supporting the West Berliners with the Berlin airlift, by essentially standing on the line of the German border and getting ready to fight on whether it's the Leine or the Weser or even the Rhine and these rivers. It creates this closeness, particularly after 1949 into the 50s onwards, where the Germans begin to see the British as protectors and allies. And, you know, when Germany is West Germany is established as a sovereign nation, when it enters NATO, they become allies. And all of that creates a far closer bond, I think, between the British, certainly in their zone, and the Germans. Now, from the American perspective, the Americans don't tend to seem to have enjoyed that same sort of experience. They tend to have stayed on their camps a lot more. I mean, their camps are massive and they are like little Americas. It has everything they need. And they don't seem to have gone off camp as much. They don't seem to have integrated into the local community as much as the British did, from what you can pick up anecdotally. Similarly, the Canadians who are based in places like Iserlohn for a while, you know, they were there too, but aren't there for as long, so don't have that long-standing interest. The French were also a bit more standoffish and a bit more sort of punitive in their attitude to the Germans. You know, they were about essentially retaking Alsace-Lorraine and the territories that, you know, that they'd lost in 1870, then won back again after the First World War, then lost again in 1940, and so they were very much more about this sort of aspect. But for the British, you know, they were there, they were interested, they knew they were going to be there for a long time, and they were determined to make the best of it. So they wanted to get out and about, they wanted to view the country. And that inevitably brought them closer together with the Germans. And it created this unique relationship that I really wanted the exhibition to cover. You know, that's why we talk about it being foe to friend, because I don't think the British Army will ever have another place where it leaves after having been there for so long, with such enthusiasm and such sorrow from the people it essentially occupied for a long time. It's really quite remarkable. And as I said, you know, even the whole title, Foe to Friend, and you heard a little bit of the interview there with General Jacobson from the Bundeswehr. You know, it was a German that came up with that. And I think that's just a really important way of looking at this relationship and this unique period in the Army's history.
Well, as you say, it is the title of our exhibition. That's why we wanted to do this first tour focusing on that major theme. We have two more tours coming up. One is going to be focused on the role that the British Army played during the Cold War, which is, of course, an important narrative in this story and an important backdrop to the time the British spent in Germany, at least a large chunk of it. That tour is called Walls and Wire, and it's going to be premiering on the 25th of February at 12 p.m. If you're watching this in the future, it will already be on our YouTube channel. But if you're here before the 25th of February 2021, watch out for that date and do sign up and make sure you're there. We will then have a third tour, which will premiere in March, and we'll tell you a bit more about that next month. Just so that you all know, Peter has written a book on this subject called British Forces in Germany, The Lived Experience, which is a fantastic read, and you can find it on our online shop. So if you visit the NAM website, www.nam.ac.uk, you can click through to the shop and have a look for it. We would all highly recommend it. And of course, Peter would as well, having written it. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us. If you would like to watch the tour again, simply go to our YouTube channel where it will be permanently available. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.